Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to share with you some thoughts and comments that I have with regard to a very interesting and entertaining and exciting film from 2003 from that great Japanese filmmaker and artist, Takeshi Kitano, also known as Beat Takeshi. That film in question is this, Zatoichi. Zatoichi is, as I say, one of Kitano's most popular and most entertaining films, and it is one of my favorites by him for a number of reasons. Now, from the very outset, we should, of course, observe that this film might be, in a certain way or from a certain perspective, might be seen to be a unique film in the context of Kitano's filmography. And I think that perspective is a reasonable one to have. So what do I mean by this? So on the one hand, this film could be said to be distinct from Kitano's other works because of certain factors, such as it is a film that is not taking place in the modern day Japan setting, like many of his other films in the past did, modern day Japan, or maybe in the case of Brother, modern day Los Angeles. But in any event, they were always taking place in the present day. Zatoichi is a film that is a period piece. It's one of these jidaigeki types of films, or swordplay types of films depicting a certain historical period in Japan. So in that sense, this might be seen as being something that is fresh and new, at least in the context of Kitano's filmography. Also, this is a Zatoichi film, and for those of you who know, of course, the Zatoichi film legacy has already been existing, and it's already been very popular in terms of a long series of films and a television series in Japan. Of course, inspired by stories of Kan Shimozawa, but then made popular in cinematic and television form through the portrayal by Shintaro Katsu in a number of films, a lot of films in fact, and then leading up from the 60s to in fact film in the late 1980s. And so there are some gaps here and there, of course, but all in all, it's a long succession of film and in some instances television appearances. And so the point is that the cinematic legacy of Zatoichi has already been firmly established by the very iconic performance of Shintaro Katsu, of Katsu. So this film by Takeshi Zatoichi is, in many respects, can be said to be very much linked to an already currently existing cinematic legacy. And so, on the one hand, it could be said to be a film that is part of the Zatoichi series or depictions of cinematic depictions of the character and story arcs, etc. And so, in that sense, it may be borrowing from that legacy, which might be said to be different from Kitano's filmography up to now, which have been, I think one can say, generally speaking, which have been more or less films that have been their own distinct entities, maybe with influences or homages to other past films, yes, but also at the same time very firmly standing quite independently. And then we have this film, Zatoichi, which could be said to be, again, part of the already existing Zatoichi legacy that we have here in Japan, and which is still very popular, as some of you may know. And of course, it is, in terms of its story, it is a Zatoichi type of story in that we have the main character who is a gambler, who is a blind wanderer, and he encounters certain situations involving innocent townfolk trying to confront or deal with sort of unsavory elements in the town that are coming from gang elements or yakuza type of organized criminal activities and money and the like. And so we have Zatoichi, the film, dealing with this main character trying to, in a sense, defend from these certain unsavory elements. And then you throw into the mix there also the threat that is posed by a very highly skilled, masterless samurai known as a ronin, or a wanderer himself, played by Tadanobu Asano. And so we have this really great rivalry of highly skilled swordsmen set up almost immediately. And the film, while portraying this story of the town and the townspeople and the main character's interaction, the Takashi character's interaction with these people and the unsavory criminal elements, we also have this story involving an almost unspoken rivalry between these two titans of swordsmanship that are bound to clash in the very ultimate climactic cinematic way. And along the way we have, well, before I get into that, let me say that thus, in essence, I think this type of story itself can be said to be very much in the spirit of a lot of the Shintaro Katsu Zatoichi films. And so this is, I think, further indication that this film is very much, or can be said to be, or can be looked upon as being very much part of the cinematic landscape or cinematic legacy of Zatoichi that has been enduring since the 60s. And in fact, it is ongoing. There have been a number of other Zatoichi films that have occurred after this film, for example. At the same time, however, I think we can acknowledge through a lot of reasons that this film is also very much a Kitano film. It is a film that, in that sense, stands on its own. It is a Zatoichi story, but it is itself its own sort of universe. I mean, one could try, I think, to make connections to past Zatoichi films, but at the same time, one can look at this film and see it as its own thing. And one, therefore, need not necessarily have seen the past Zatoichi films in order to be able to watch this and understand this and thus be entertained by this. So in that sense, I think it is an independent type of work. In terms of its storyline, at least it can be seen that way. Another thing, too, is that it is a very much through and through a Kitano film, in that it presents situations of violence and sudden eruptions of energy in that way that we are very much accustomed to in the universe of Kitano's filmography, namely the careful application of stillness and paced timing and editing, and the way that editing is carefully applied in almost an antithetical way. Also, the way that the camera glides seems to be, in essence, an ability to capture sudden eruptions of energy and violence in this otherwise serenely set landscape. At the same time, there are really some interesting innovations that are being applied by Kitano and his filmmaking craft vis-a-vis the depiction of swordsplay and violence. In particular, note the reliance on CG and for a lot of the swords play and the sort of gruesome after effects of the violent acts. A lot of CG is applied, which was, I think, at the time, a really interesting application of the effects. And of course, the question arises as to whether those application of CG effects have aged well or not as the years have progressed. But I'll get to that point a little bit later in this video, because I think there's an interesting way to view this aspect of the application of CG. But in any event, we do see this kind of use of CG in this way that makes it very much linked to the way that depictions of energy and violence are shown on screen, which I think is, on the one hand, maybe it can be said to be very much a part of the Kitano filmmaking spirit that we've seen before, but also maybe an interesting innovation in that regard. In any event, it is, I think, very exciting and very much in keeping keeping with the storyline, which, as I say, involves a lot of swordplay, a lot of violence, a lot of fights between people. And that's one of the great appeals and popular points of this and other Zatoichi films. So that's, I think, an interesting way to see the Kitano filmography, cinema craftsmanship element here. And also we have a Kitano film with Beat Takashi front and center, with many of the performers and actors that we have seen in past Kitano works. So this does feel like a world that is inhabited by Kitano's company and his many familiar faces appear in some really great performances. And we have the doses of comedy that are applied in that wonderful visual gag humor or low-brow sexual innuendo type of humor, and also the sketch comedy type of gags that Beat Takashi, as a comedian and performer and television personality, became really famous for. And those are on display very vividly and very actively in this film. I mean, there are some interesting juxtapositions that are made, which is very consistent with Kitano's filmography in the past, whereas he's able to juxtapose different tones of violence and tragedy on the one hand, and comedy and wry and dry humor and visual gags on the other. And there are some instances here that are absolutely brilliant in the way that he is able to balance these two tones. Some scenes that depict really serious down points in the narrative are suddenly punctuated with really interesting and almost randomly applied elements of comedy that are brilliantly applied in their randomness, I would say. And that is, I think, consistent with the Kitano Beat Takashi style of comedy. So it's right here through this film, through and through, and thus this makes this film very much consistent with and part of the body of work that is the filmography of Takeshi Kitano, very much so. And I should point out, too, that I mentioned earlier the idea of the CG, the computer effects work used for the swords play and the depictions of violence that result from the swordplay action scenes. We see actually a lot of the CG applied, and I brought up the question as to whether or not this type of application of CG, especially it being very front and center, whether it is something that can age well over time. And I think people might have differing opinions on this. On the one hand, I can see the viewpoint about how the CG might not necessarily be, it might not age as well as one might otherwise think over time. I can see that perspective on the one hand. On the other hand, there is something of a computer graphic, almost video game-like quality to Kitano's films, and especially to a film like Zatoichi. And I mean that 100% positively. I think that is a brilliant aspect, actually, of Kitano's filmography and his films, and Zatoichi in particular. And if I can be a little bit more specific about that, all the way through our discussion of Kitano's works, it's been one of my assertions that one of the things that Kitano does really well is he boils the drama down to their very essences. And instead of relying on genre traits in order to create narrative constructions to bring the characters together, and thus they will have some kind of confrontation, he in essence does away with all that, and instead boils the drama down to the very essence. So you just have character A and character B. There's a tension between them, so they're going to meet. How are they going to meet? They're going to meet, let's say, walking from this character from one side of the screen, this character from the other side of the screen. They're going to walk together, and then they're going to meet, or they're just going to happen to be together. And then we see the consequences of that drama unfold. So the drama is boiled down to its essence, and then the consequences erupt from the confrontation that occurs from that drama. I think that's really great. Therefore, what that means is for the staging of the characters in a particular scene or frame, it's not necessarily a realist approach to characters meeting, but rather it is a cinematic, poetic approach that takes many liberties in lieu of a realistic approach, and thus in more of a direct cinematic approach. Thus, the concern of Takeshi Kitano is not how the characters get to this point in order to meet, but rather let's just have them meet in the next scene and then let's see what happens. And so we therefore see what might be said to be maybe unnatural configurations of character, how they suddenly emerge in the screen or in a particular scene, etc. But I think that's part of the way that, as I say, Kitano boils things down to their very essence and then lets that essence carry through, and we see the consequences thereof, which I think is really fascinating. And I think a lot of that kind of boiling down to the very essence is at the heart of a lot of the scenes, in particular some of the action scenes of this film. Characters suddenly emerge, and then we see the consequences of the confrontations that occur, whether the confrontations be human drama or whether they be via swordplay. And I think that is very consistent, and it's great because Kitano focuses in on the consequences of this drama. And going back to a video game type of aesthetic, I think one way also is in a lot of video games, maybe in particular two-dimensional video games, there is also this essence of like the good guy and the bad guy. They meet upon, let's say, a scrolling screen, and there is a sense of a sort of an inevitability of their meeting. And of course, there's some gameplay that occurs along the way, which is part of the excitement of playing a game. But ultimately, characters meet. And we see not the circumstances, but rather we see the confrontation and the consequences of that through the gameplay. And so I always thought personally that Zatoichi was and other Kitano films, in a very subtle and maybe nuanced way, were exhibiting this kind of video game type of aesthetic. Maybe not 100% through and through, of course. I mean, and there are other ways and there are other aesthetics that are being applied to his cinema. Of course, I get that. But another way to look at it is there is a kind of video game aesthetic of the boiling down to their essences of characters meeting and characters confronting each other. And I think that is very much on display, especially in a film like Zatoichi. And there's levels and layering of this kind of action swords play that is it feels very much like in one way of looking at it, a video game type of aesthetic, which I think is really cool and really quite profound. And on a visual cue type of level, this use of CG, maybe in a subliminal way, can be said to be linked to this video game type of aesthetic. Plus, on an audio or music level, the music by Keiichi Suzuki is really very cool and one of my favorite scores for a Kitano film. And it has that electronic synthesizer type of score that I think can be said also to be of a type or genre that is often associated with maybe a video game type of environment. And so I think these elements, maybe whether they are on purpose or perhaps more subliminal, in any event, they do lend themselves very nicely to one viewpoint or one perspective when looking at this film, and perhaps even other films by Kitano, namely the way in which the quote-unquote video game aesthetic and grammar seem to be applied to a certain degree in films like Zatoichi's. And I think that is a brilliant concept, and one that I think carries the film through over time, and thus helps, at least me, if I were to ever feel like the CG is a little bit dated, I can then rely on this kind of perspective and then look at it through that lens and see how this kind of aesthetic is really meant to propel the story forward in the Kitano style that I'm trying to suggest here. Finally, another strong argument to be made about this film being very consistent with the Kitano filmography, despite some of the differences that might be said to be existing from certain perspectives. One of the main reasons why I think this is very consistent is the way in which Kitano, in this film, uses certain signifiers or symbols of Japanese society and culture and turns them on their head in a very fresh and inventive and invigorating way. And I think perhaps the most striking example of this could be the way that Kitano is using the jidaigeki elements in this film. This is, after all, a period piece, a jidaigeki type of swords play film involving this legacy of Zatoichi, which we have known through past films, of course. So that, I think, is a really big symbol that he is relying on, this already currently existing cinematic legacy of Zatoichi. But he seems to be turning that a little bit on its head and putting a fresh spin on the character in terms of the look, in terms of the, for example, the color of hair that's applied, the costume, the walk, the weapon that's employed, and other key points of the character that are revealed throughout the film that I think make for very, very interesting and exciting takes on the, as I say, already existing cinematic legacy of Zatoichi. So that's one way where he seems to be taking a currently existing signifier or representation and twisting it or doing variations on a theme and making it maybe a wholly new thing. That's one thing. The other thing, too, is the use of rhythm and tap dance and performance. A lot has been made in terms of how dance, the stripes, how the dance performances and tap dance is integrated into many of the scenes. A lot of the tap dance rhythm, the percussion type of rhythm, is integrated into the score and also into the ballad type of walk and dance-like movements of a lot of the characters, even as they're walking from place to place to place, including the beat Takashi character himself. And so this is interesting too, because this seems to be, again, using the quote-unquote traditional setting of Japanese period films, but then applying what might be said to be modern takes on performative dance, namely tap dance and the like. And this is applied, I think, integrated very nicely throughout the film. And also there is some very explosively brilliant expressions of dance and dance performance when connected to the notion of Japanese matsuri, or Japanese festivals. Japanese festivals are really wonderful things, and they are oftentimes depicted in cinema in terms of the traditional aesthetic of the Japanese festival or matsuri. Here, I think what Kitano does really brilliantly is he takes the matsuri aesthetic or environment, but then he applies the quote-unquote modern day dance aesthetic of tap dance and performative theater, and he turns it into this new, fresh thing, and you combine that with the wonderful percussive way that the music is employed, and there's a sense of the old becoming new. And I think that is, in essence, the way that Kitano deals really skillfully with, let's say, signifiers or representations or symbols of Japanese culture and society. He takes them that seem to be already existing, and then he turns them on their heads or makes a spin or a twist on them and makes them feel wholly fresh and new and reinvented, as it were. And that makes this film, I think, a great example of the filmography of Kitano, because, as I would argue, we have seen a lot of that operation of reworkings of traditional signifiers. We have seen this in action a lot in Kitano's past films, and here I think it is on display so forcefully and so confidently and with such freshness that it feels like a cinematic miracle that I am watching something that is, on the one hand, representing something very traditional, and yet it's representing it in a way that feels new and fresh and completely on a different plane altogether. And that is, I think, the trick and the genius of the filmography of Takeshi Kitano, and that is, I think, at the heart of why this film is so successful, in my view. This is one of his most artistically successful films, and it is one of my favorite films by him, and it is so entertaining and enthralling. And it's interesting, too, as I tried to indicate in this video, just how time seems to be treating it. And perhaps through the treatment of time, we can then be able to look at this film through varying degrees of perspective and the lenses that we apply when we as viewers watch this and other films. And so even now I find this film to be so refreshing, so brilliant, so much, very much unique, but also very much consistent within the context of the filmography of the great filmmaker Takeshi Kitano. This is, of course, the film Zatoichi. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much for your time. As always, I really, really appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.